At this point, we're going to move on to the subcortical structures, discussing the major anatomical features of these structures. And we're going to begin with the thalamus, which is a walnut-sized subcortical structure right at the center of the brain. Unlike the cortex, where neurons are organized into layers, subcortical structures are clumps of neurons separated by regions mostly filled with axons. And these clumps are called nuclei. One nucleus has a pronounced pattern of connectivity with other brain structures, and this pattern is different for different nuclei. Furthermore, one nucleus generally contains similar types of neurons, with different neurons in different nuclei. One major nucleus can also contain a number of subnuclei, and often all the subnuclei contain similar neurons. The thalamus is one of the bigger nuclei, located centrally in the brain between the cortical hemispheres, with a number of other subcortical nuclei located around it. It's made up of two oval masses, grey matter 3 or 4 centimeters long, the left and the right thalamus. And it has a pronounced internal structure. In this view, you can see the prominent Y-shaped axon bands known as the midline, which separates some of the subnuclei of the thalamus. Looking more closely, there are about 15 large subnuclei in the main body of the thalamus. These are sometimes called the dorsal nuclei. All of these nuclei have strong reciprocal connectivity with the cortex, and the relay nuclei, like the lateral geniculate nucleus on the bottom left, manage the flow of sensory information into the cortex. There's also a number of smaller nuclei that are arranged around the outside of the main body of the thalamus and also along the axon bundles that divide it up. The midline nuclei are located where the two halves of the thalamus face each other. The thalamic reticular nucleus, or TRN, is a thin shell of neurons wrapped around the outside of the dorsal nuclei, except where the midline nuclei are located. Each dorsal nucleus has a separate region of the TRN with which it's closely associated. Then there are also the intralaminar nuclei that are located in the axon regions between the dorsal nuclei. The massa intermedia is a bundle of axons that connects the left and right halves of the thalamus together. The major nuclei of the thalamus are duplicated on the left and right sides of the brain, and these nuclei are mostly labelled by their relative positions. The anterior nucleus, or AN, and the ventral anterior nucleus, or VA, are located at the front. The medial dorsal, or MD, centrally, the ventral posterior and lateral posterior towards the back. However, the nucleus located right at the back is labelled P, called the pulvinar. Let's just illustrate the subnuclei of the left thalamus and add 2 additional subnuclei not illustrated so far. They're present in both the left and the right thalamic nuclei, but to simplify the diagram, I've just illustrated them on the right. These are the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, and the medial geniculate nucleus. Information from the ears goes first to the medial geniculate nucleus, not directly to the cortex. The first cortical area that processes auditory information is the primary auditory cortex, but this area isn't directly connected to the ears. Rather, there's strong reciprocal connectivity between the primary auditory cortex and the MGN. Similarly, the optic nerve from the eyes goes to the LGN, and the LGN has strong reciprocal connectivity with the primary visual cortex, where the first cortical processing of visual information takes place. It's also interesting that a neuron in the LGN only gets 5 to 10% of its inputs from the optic nerve. Over 90% come from the cortex, or from elsewhere within the thalamus. And the implication is that only a highly processed version of visual inputs is actually reaching the cortex. In the same way, touch and body position information get to the somatosensory cortex via the VP nucleus. All the other nuclei interface with different cortical areas. The typical pattern is that one nucleus is reciprocally connected with one or a small group of cortical areas, although it may get inputs from a rather wider range of areas. So the pulvinar is reciprocally connected with visual areas V2, V3, and so on. The VL nucleus is reciprocally connected with the motor cortex and also the supplementary motor cortex. The VA nucleus is reciprocally connected with just the supplementary motor cortex. The MD nucleus is reciprocally connected with the prefrontal cortex. The LP is reciprocally connected with the medial prefrontal cortex, the LD with the entorhinal cortex, and the anterior thalamic nucleus is reciprocally connected with the hippocampus, as we touched on earlier. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all these nuclei get inputs from some additional cortical areas, but don't strongly project back to those areas. And in addition, all these nuclei get strong inputs from the basal ganglia and also from the cerebellum. The midline nuclei project diffusely to a much wider range of cortical areas, and in addition, these midline nuclei also project to part of the basal ganglia, the striatum in fact. The intralaminar nuclei located in the axon regions between the dorsal nuclei have a similar pattern of connectivity. Finally, each of these major nuclei has a region of the TRN associated with it, and all the connectivity between the thalamic nucleus and the cortex passes through that associated TRN. The major nuclei all contain the same types of neurons. The thalamocortical projection neuron is the most common. It's excitatory, and as its name suggests, it projects to the cortex. Like the cortical pyramidal neurons, it's spiny, and its neurotransmitter is glutamate. But it looks quite different from a pyramidal neuron. Lots of dendrites coming out from all directions, and these neurons get a lot of inputs from the cortex. There's also small inhibitory GABAergic interneurons in the main nuclei. These neurons only target thalamocortical neurons within their own nucleus. A third major type of neuron in the thalamus is the inhibitory GABAergic reticular cell that you find just in the TRN. I mentioned that the axons between one major nucleus and the cortex all pass through a region of the TRN associated with that nucleus. These axons drop side branches onto the reticular cells, so the cells get their inputs from both the cortex and from the thalamus, and they project back to just the thalamocortical neurons in their associated major nucleus. Then there are the neurons located in the midline and the intralaminar nuclei. These are excitatory projection neurons, but they have fewer and rather less spiny dendrites than the thalamocortical projection neurons. There are also inhibitory interneurons that have lots of small, short side branches, maybe a bit similar to spines.